The billionaire hired her to watch his jet get fueled, and she was doing exactly that, standing under the wing of a $50 million Gulfstream at 5:04 in the morning, running the single-point refuel panel, when he came down the air stair and realized the woman he'd paid $16.40 an hour to babysit his airplane was flying it with her hands. Not the hose. The panel. She ran the fuel quantity cross-check in order. Left tank. Right. Crossfeed. A limitation murmured under her breath. Low automatic, the way you only say a thing that lives in your body. Line crew fuel the airplane. They do not talk to it. Everett Grange stopped on the second step. $2.1 billion. A coat that cost more than her car. And a wound he'd buried so long ago he'd forgotten it could still open, because he came up from the 9th Ward being told a boy like him could fuel the jets and clean the jets and would never sit in one. He knew that murmur. He'd murmured it himself once at 19 before a man in an expensive watch told him to stop wanting. "Where," he said, "did you learn to do it in that order?" She didn't turn right away. She ran her palm down the leading edge first, check the seam nobody checks, the way her grandmother taught her. Then she looked at him. 58-year-old Everett Grange had not asked a stranger a real question in 9 years. The alarm went off at 3:40. Renata Colson was already awake. She was always already awake. That is the first thing it takes, not the money but the sleep. She lay in a one-bedroom on Delary Street with 2 kids breathing on the far side of a bedsheet she'd hung from the ceiling to make 2 rooms out of one, and she ran the arithmetic she ran every morning before her feet hit the floor. Rent was $1,275 due the 1st, and it was the 29th. Checking held $91.06. The light bill was $84. The gas she'd already let go. And folded in the pocket of her work coat, where it always was, there was a drawing. Deja had made it. 11 years old, and she drew the same thing every time, an airplane, nose angled up off a single straight line, climbing. A departure profile. She didn't know that was the name for it. She only knew her mother went to the airport in the dark and came home smelling like jet fuel, so in her drawings the planes always left. They left for someone. Renata folded it back into her pocket. She'd folded it so many times the crease had gone soft as cloth. She made 2 lunches at the counter in the dark by the light of the open refrigerator, because the kitchen bulb had gone out on the 12th, and a 4-pack was 6.48s, and 6.48s was not, that week, a thing she had. Peanut butter, store brand, the white label kind. 2 slices each. The ends of the loaf she kept for herself. 1 clementine split, half in Malik's. She cut both sandwiches on the diagonal, because Malik, who was 7, would not eat them cut straight, and she had stopped fighting the wars she couldn't win to save herself for the ones she could. She took inventory of the crisper. Habit. Training. Half a loaf. Peanut butter 2/3 gone. 3 clementines. Milk with 2 days in it. String cheese, the good kind which was for the children and which she had not touched. 4 eggs. There was no coffee. No butter. Nothing in that refrigerator a woman might have bought for herself. No soda she liked. No small good thing set aside for a hard day. She'd stopped buying for herself so long ago she no longer noticed, and the not noticing was its own quiet catastrophe, the kind nobody films. Malik surfaced once at 3:52, padding out in socks to stand in the refrigerator light. He asked, in the flat, serious voice of a boy told too much for his age, whether they were going to have to move again. She said no. She told him to go back to sleep. She did not tell him that no was a hope and not a fact, because there are lies a mother is allowed, and that is one of them. She checked his forehead with 2 fingers. No fever. She turned him gently back toward the bedsheet wall, and he went, trusting her the way the whole airplane trusts the one who does the walk-around. There was a woman next door named Miss Antoinette, 71, who had lived on Delary Street since before the water came in 2005, and never left, not through the storm and not through everything after. She walked Deja and Malik to the bus stop every morning for $8 a week, and she had never once raised the price, not when her own light bill came, not when the corner store started charging $4 for a loaf of bread. She kept a coffee can of ones in her kitchen for exactly the neighbors who needed a bus fare and were too proud to ask twice, And she had, more than once, slipped a folded 5 into Deja's coat pocket, where Renata would not find it until the child was already at school. Renata knew. Renata always knew. She had stopped trying to refuse it, because Antoinette had a line she used, delivered flat, that ended the argument every time. That on Delary Street they had been looking after their own long before anybody with money noticed they existed, and they would be doing it long after those people got bored and looked away. That was the thing the news never got right about a neighborhood like this. Before any billionaire ever came down an air stair, before any outsider ever looked across instead of down, there was already a coffee can of ones in a kitchen, and a 71-year-old woman walking 2 children to a bus stop in the cold, checking on them the way you check what nobody sees. Renata left the lunches on the second shelf with a note for Antoinette, the way she did every morning, and stepped out into the dark. Then she walked out into the dark and went to fuel other people's airplanes. Here is what almost nobody at Signature FBO knew about the woman who dragged their fuel hoses. She had 4,200 hours in the air. She'd held the right seat of a regional jet, then the right seat of a corporate G550, the exact model she now fueled in the dark. She was type-rated on it. That rating did not expire the way a gym membership expires. It was not a piece of paper. It was a thing she had built into her hands over 18 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars, a set of motions so deep in her body that she still, 2 years later, ran the fuel imbalance cross-check under her breath without deciding to. A license is a piece of paper the government can let expire. A rating is something you build into your hands, and nobody, not a director, not a roomer, not 26 months, can unbuild it. Her medical had lapsed 26 months ago. Not because she failed it. Because a first-class medical costs money, and recurrent simulator training to stay current costs $3,410, and when the choice is between currency and your children's rent, a rated pilot fuels the jet. That is the arithmetic. It is not a tragic flaw. It is a bill. She knew that airplane the way you know a house you grew up in. She knew the sound the 8 made on a cold start. She knew where the fuel sat heavy if you loaded it wrong. She knew the point on the taxi where this model wanted to wander left. She knew the checklist. She knew the limitations. And every morning she walked up to $50 million of it and touched it only with a nozzle, and walked away, and clocked out, and rode a bus home. A rated pilot, a fuel hose, and a bus, that was the shape of it. None of it was in her hands anymore except the part that mattered most, which was all of it. Which was the only part that couldn't be taken. She just couldn't afford to use it. Renata had grown up on a flight line, more or less. Her grandmother, Ruth Colson, cleaned airplanes at the old Mazant field for 30 years, the lavatories, the galleys, the carpets ground with other people's crumbs and other people's ease. Ruth raised her on that ramp in the hours between school and the last bus. And Ruth taught her one thing over and over, in the flat, certain voice of a woman who'd watched 1,000 flights leave without her. The whole airplane, Ruth used to say, wiping down a tray table nobody would thank her for, trusts the person who does the walk-around. Because she's the only one who checks what nobody sees. Renata heard it in her body every time she touched a leading edge. Check what nobody sees. She checked seams on wings. She checked the soft crease of a folded drawing. She checked her children's foreheads in the dark with the same 2 fingers she'd once used to check a fuel cap was flush. It was all the same gesture. It was the only inheritance Ruth had to leave, and it turned out to be the one that mattered. Ruth died at 68 in a folding chair by a window that faced the wrong way to see any airplanes at all. Renata sat with her the last night and listened to her grandmother name, from memory, the tail numbers of aircraft scrapped 20 years back. Ruth never flew. She cleaned the insides of machines she was never invited to ride in, 3 decades, without a day of bitterness Renata ever saw. The closest she came to grief about it was a thing she said once, near the end, looking at nothing. She said the airplanes never knew who was rich. She said the airplane couldn't tell a first-class ticket from a mop. It only knew who had checked the things that keep it in the sky. She said that was the one place in America she'd ever found where the truth was flat and didn't care about your name. She said Renata should get inside one someday. Not to clean it. To fly it. She said it the way you tell a child a thing you've already decided is impossible, So at least the wanting belongs to them and doesn't die with you. Renata got inside one. She got the right seat. She earned the rating on the exact airplane her grandmother had wiped down for other people's comfort. She'd meant to take Ruth up on a repositioning leg, one empty flight, just the two of them in the flat truth of the sky. Ruth died 14 months before it could happen, and the wanting came back down to Renata after all. Folded, soft at the crease. Now cut across the country and back 40 years to a boy named Everett Grange. He was 14 the first time he touched an airplane, and it was to clean it. Desire Project's 9th Ward. A mother who cleaned houses and a father who was a name and a photograph. He got a ramp job at 16 because he was big and quiet and would work doubles, and he fell in love with the machines the way only a poor kid falls for something enormous and indifferent that does not care where he's from. He read the manuals other men left in the crew lounge. He learned the systems. By 19 he was a crew chief, and he knew those airplanes cold, better than half the men who flew them. He asked once about the seat, about how a man gets to the left seat. The chief pilot, Everett, could still see the face, could describe the exact watch on the man's wrist 40 years later, looked at him the way you look at a boy who said something charming and impossible. He told him some men fuel the airplanes and some men fly them. He told him it was good to know which kind you were early, so you didn't waste your life wanting. Everett didn't waste his life. He built a freight company instead. He built it into $2.1 billion, and a fleet and a hangar at Lakefront with his own name on it, and somewhere in there he bought the exact make of jet he'd been told he could only clean. He flew in the back of it in a $4,000 coat, and he never once said out loud what everyone who came up his way already knew, that he'd bought the whole sky to prove a dead chief pilot wrong, and it had not made the wanting stop. That was the wound, grounded by a sentence at 19. And no amount of money had ever ungrounded him. You could see the whole architecture of him in that, if you knew where to look. A man who had answered a single cruel sentence spoken on a wet ramp in 1985 by spending the next 40 years assembling a $2 billion company, a fleet of aircraft, a hangar with his name in 10-foot letters, and a jet identical to the ones he'd been told to clean, and who still, after all of it, could be undone before breakfast by the sight of a woman running a fuel panel in the right order, because the buying had never once touched the wanting, and some part of him had always known it wouldn't. So when he came down his own air stair at 5'4" and watched a woman in a signature uniform run a fuel panel flow in the exact order of a pre-flight cross-check, murmuring a limitation the way you only do if it lives in your hands, something in his chest that had been closed a very long time came open. All at once, like a cabin door blown at altitude. He asked her where she learned to do it in that order. She checked the leading edge first. Then she told him she hadn't learned it. She'd earned it. And she went back to fueling his airplane, because it was 5:06 and the order was for 8,000 pounds, and she was paid by the hour to move fuel, not to talk about a life that no longer had room in it for the word pilot. There was a man named Marcus Toll who ran line service that shift. 34. Ex-Navy, an aviation machinist's mate before he got out, which meant he knew what a checklist flow sounded like from the inside. He'd heard Renata murmur one over a fuel panel 3 weeks back and gone very still. He'd tested it once. Just once. Standing at the wing with her, he'd said, low half to himself, that the number 2 boost pump on this model always sounded rough on start. A small thing. Also true only if you'd sat in the seat and heard it come up. And Renata, not looking at him, coiling hose, corrected him without thinking. It was the number 1 pump, cold side, only below a certain fuel temperature, and then caught herself and shut her mouth and finished the coil in silence. Marcus said nothing. You do not in that world ask a woman fueling jets at dawn why she talks to the airplane like she used to sit inside it. But he filed it away. He filed a lot of things away about Renata Colson. He suspected she was the most overqualified person on the ramp. He suspected she'd rather he choke on the words than say them out loud. So he watched. And he waited. He watched the way she did her own kind of walk-around on everything. The fuel cap, the seam, the faces of the men who gave her orders, checking what nobody else bothered to check. And he did not yet know the waiting was about to be worth something. By 5:40 the sun was coming up gray over Lake Pontchartrain. Renata coiled the hose. She signed the fuel slip, $16.40 an hour, 8,000 pounds moved, her name on the line in a database that also held, 3 folders over, another entry with her name that she did not know existed. She walked to the break room to eat nothing, because there was nothing, and to look at a drawing of an airplane climbing off a single line towards someone else's morning. She looked at it a while. Then she folded it, soft at the crease. The billionaire watched her go. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know about Ruth or Delary Street or the $3,410 or the 26 months or the lie sitting in a database with her name on it, waiting. He knew one thing, the way he knew weather and freight, and the exact moment a deal was about to turn. The paperwork said she was line crew. Her hands said the paperwork was lying. The Grange Flight Department arrived at 6:15 on a Thursday, and Dale Whitmer got out of the crew van the way some men get out of vehicles they did not pay for, like the pavement should be grateful. He was the director of flight operations. 47. Pressed. A lanyard of badges. The kind of man who used the word asset for airplanes, and when he thought no one was translating, for people. He ran the ramp like he owned the people on it. He did not look at line crew. Looking at line crew was not, in his understanding of the world, a thing his job required, and so the woman coiling the ground wire near the wheel of N550EG was, to him, roughly furniture. A shape near the airplane. A cost center in a signature uniform. Renata had seen 100 Dale Whitmers. You learn the type early on a ramp. She kept her head down and her hands moving and let the man be exactly as large as he needed to feel. Then his 2 pilots misread the airplane. She wasn't listening on purpose. That is the thing about a rating built into your hands. You don't get to turn it off. The 2 Grange pilots stood at the open panel, arguing about a fuel imbalance, and one of them said the limit was 1,500 pounds lateral before you had to act, and the other wasn't sure. And they were both, quietly, wrong, and the number that was correct rose up out of Renata's body before she could stop it. 600, she said. 600 pounds lateral. 1,500's the ferry limit, and only with the placard. Silence on the ramp. The younger pilot looked at her the way you look at a vending machine that has spoken. The older one opened his mouth. And Dale Whitmer, who had been ignoring her for 11 minutes, turned around and finally saw her, not as a person, but as a problem, a line service contractor coaching his flight crew in front of him, which is to say, a thing that had made him look small on his own ramp. He did not raise his voice. Cruelty at that altitude rarely does. He asked if she flew Gulf Streams. He asked it the way you ask a child if she runs a hospital. He said the fuel numbers were the crew's job, and the panel was the crew's job, and her job was the hose. And did she understand the difference between the person who fuels the airplane and the person who flies it? Because in his experience it was good to know which one you were, so you didn't embarrass yourself. He did not know he had just repeated, almost word for word, a sentence spoken to a 19-year-old crew chief on a wet ramp in 1985. He did not know Everett Grange was standing 40 feet away by the hangar door and had heard all of it. Whitmer never checked what nobody sees. That was the whole of his character in a single habit. He never looked at the seam because he had decided long ago that the seam did not concern him. Renata's grandmother would have known him in one glance. Ruth Colson had cleaned airplanes for 30 years for men exactly like Dale Whitmer, and she used to say there were 2 kinds of people who worked around aircraft. There were the ones who checked what nobody sees, and there were the ones who assumed somebody else already had. She said the second kind always flew fine, right up until the day they didn't, and that the whole business of a walk-around was one honest person refusing to assume. Whitmer was the second kind all the way down. He had built a career on the assumption that the people beneath him were exactly as small as his convenience required. He had never once in his life done the walk-around on a human being. It was going to cost him everything. He just didn't know it yet, because the woman he'd decided was furniture had checked a seam 26 months deep and had never stopped looking for it. Renata said nothing. She picked up the hose. She did her job. But something in her face had gone very still and very flat, the way water goes flat right before it freezes, and Marcus Toll, watching from the fuel truck, saw it and felt something in his own chest bank hard to the left. He'd seen that stillness before. On a carrier, years ago, on the face of a good mechanic getting dressed down by an officer who didn't know a torque wrench from a tire iron. The specific stillness of someone who knows more than the person humiliating them and has learned that saying so only costs more. It was the most expensive silence in the world. Marcus knew exactly what it cost because he'd paid it himself, and he found that he could not, this time, keep filing it away. He waited until Whitmer's crew had gone into the FBO for coffee. Then he crossed the ramp to where Renata was recoiling the ground wire, and he said the thing he'd been not saying for 3 weeks. He said he'd been a machinist's mate. He said he knew what a checklist flow sounded like out of a person's mouth, and he knew what a 600-pound lateral limit was, and he knew that people who fuel airplanes for $16 an hour do not, as a rule, carry Gulfstream fuel limitations in their bodies. He said it plainly, no pity in it, because he'd have hated the pity himself. Then he asked the only question that mattered. He asked her what she used to fly. Renata looked at him a long moment, read his face the way you read a panel, found no cruelty in it, only recognition, and she almost told him. You could see her almost tell him. Then 26 months of a closed door won, the way it had won 100 times, and she said the hose was getting away from him, and would he grab the far end? He grabbed the far end. He did not push. But he'd asked, and she'd almost answered, and both of them knew the door had moved for the first time in 2 years. Here is the part of the story that is not a story. Renata Colson did not lose her career because she was not good enough. She lost it to arithmetic, and the arithmetic is real, and it is doing to thousands of qualified aviators right now exactly what it did to her. To fly for a living, you cannot simply be able to fly. You have to be current, and current is a bill that comes due on a schedule that does not care about your circumstances. A first-class medical certificate, the one an airline pilot must hold, costs somewhere between $100 and $200 every single renewal, and it has to be renewed every 6 to 12 months, and standard health insurance does not cover it because the government considers it an occupational cost and not a medical one. That is the small recurring wound. The large one is the training. A type rating, the certification that says you are qualified on a specific aircraft, the exact thing Renata held on the G550, costs on the open market between $25,000 and $40,000. Airlines pay it for their own pilots. They do not pay it for a pilot who has fallen out of the system and is trying to climb back in. The bridge course an airline pilot needs, the ATP certification training, runs a national average of $4,200 to $4,800 in 2026. And the recurrent training and proficiency checks that keep any of it valid stack up to somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000 a year, every year, forever, in good years and bad. Add it up. For a pilot with money, it is a line item. For a pilot who is 184 light bill from the dark, it is a wall. Not a hurdle. A wall. Renata owed $3,410 on a single lapsed recurrency invoice, the one training event that would have restored her currency. $3,410. She had earned 4,200 hours in the sky, and she was $3,410 away from being allowed to use them, and she made $16.40 an hour, and she had 2 children, and the math did what the math does. The seat does not go to the best pilot. It goes to the pilot who can afford to stay current. And the people who fall through that particular floor are, overwhelmingly, the ones who were already holding on with both hands. Lower-income aviators, and disproportionately black and brown and female ones, priced out of a profession they had already proven they could do. She had done the arithmetic so many times it had worn a groove. 4,200 hours. $3,410. $16.40 an hour. 2 children. If she saved every cent she did not spend on rent, food, gas, the light bill, and the children, which was, in a good month, nothing, and in a bad month, less than nothing, she would clear the recurrency invoice in never. That was the answer. Never. She had run the numbers on a napkin in the break room more than once, and the napkin always said the same thing, and she always folded it up small and threw it away, the way you throw away a diagnosis you already knew. 4,200 hours in the air. 0 of them she was currently allowed to use. 0. The system did not have a line for what Renata Colson could do. It only had a line for what she could pay. And someone, 26 months ago, had made very sure that line stayed empty. Everett Grange found her at the end of the shift, by the fuel truck, and he did the worst possible thing a rich man can do to a proud woman. He offered to fix it with money. A check. That was his instinct. Reach for the checkbook. He was gentle about it. He did not know yet that gentle was not the problem. He said he'd made some calls. He said the recurrency invoice was $3,400 and change, and that was, to him. He did not finish the sentence, because there was no polite end to it, but she heard the end anyway. Nothing. It was nothing to him. He said he could have it paid by Monday. He said it like he was handing her back something she'd dropped. And Renata Colson, who had eaten nothing that day, and whose son had asked at 3:52 that morning whether they'd have to move, looked at $2.1 billion in a $4,000 coat and said no. She said she didn't want his money. She said it quietly, without heat, which is the only way pride survives in a body that tired. She told him a paid invoice would put her currency back and change nothing, because currency was never the thing that broke. Something broke 26 months ago, upstream of the money, and she had never been able to see what, and a check would just paper over the hole so completely that she'd never find it. She did not want to be his good deed. She did not want to be the $43 he told a nice story about at dinner. She wanted the one thing money can't buy back and can only sometimes dig up. She wanted the truth. Because here is what a check could not undo. That somewhere in the 26 months since her career ended, on a morning she could not remember, and for a reason no one had ever explained to her face, a thing had happened to her name that turned every door she pushed against into a wall she could not see. So that she had spent 2 years applying and being passed over and never once being told why. Until she had started to believe the lie the world tells every proud person it has quietly decided to discard. That maybe the problem was her, that maybe she simply wasn't good enough anymore, and a paid invoice would have let that lie stand forever. She would not let it stand. I don't need you to pay for it, she said. One direct line, flat as the ramp. I need to know why I have to. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the bus, and Everett Grange stood by the fuel truck, holding an offer no one had ever refused, and understood, slowly, that he had been asked to do something much harder than write a check. He went back inside the hangar. There was a workstation there, the Grange Flight Department's own ops terminal, still logged in. Whitmer's people were not careful, because careful is a thing you learn when someone can hurt you, and no one could hurt them. Everett owned the company. He owned the terminal. He typed her name into the crew record system the way he'd once read manuals other men left behind, and the file came up and there was a note in it, a flag, an old one, entered 26 months back. Check ride failure. Do not rehire. Everett Grange had spent 40 years around airplanes and the people who fly them. He knew the way you know whether, when a thing on a page was wrong. He read the note twice. He did not yet know whose hand had typed it, or why, or that it was a lie built to protect a favor. He only knew that he had watched those hands run a fuel quantity cross-check in perfect order at 5 in the morning, murmuring a limitation that lived in her body, and that no one who had actually busted a check ride talks to an airplane the way she talked to that one. The paper said she failed. Her hands had never failed anything in their life. He found her the next morning before the sun, on the far side of the ramp, where the ground crew took the breaks nobody scheduled. She was sitting on an overturned bucket with a thermos of coffee she had made at home, because the machine inside cost $1.75. Everett Grange, worth $2.1 billion, walked across 60 feet of wet concrete and sat down on the bucket next to her without asking, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the airplane sat in the dark like animals sleeping. Then he told her about the watch. He said there was a man 40 years ago, a chief pilot, and he could still describe the watch on the man's wrist. He said he'd been 19 and a crew chief, and he'd known those airplanes better than half the men who flew them, and he had asked one time, only one time, how a man gets to the left seat. He said the man had looked at him and told him some men fuel the airplanes and some men fly them, and that it was good to know which kind you were early, so you didn't waste your life wanting. He said he had spent 40 years proving that man wrong. He'd built the company. He'd bought the fleet. He'd put his name on a hangar and bought the exact jet he'd once been told he could only clean, and he flew in the back of it in a coat that cost $4,000. And none of it. He wanted her to understand this. He needed one person alive to understand it. None of it had made the wanting stop. He'd bought the whole sky. And the boy on the wet ramp was still standing there, still 19, still holding the question. Then he'd come down his own air stair at 5 in the morning and watched her hands run a fuel quantity cross-check in perfect order, murmuring a limitation that lived in her body, and he had heard the boy on the ramp start screaming. "I know what it costs," he said. "Not gently now." "True. To be the best one out there and be handed the hose. I've known for 40 years. I just never had to watch it happen to somebody else." Renata Colson did not say anything for a long moment. She had spent 26 months being looked at with pity, and pity she could deflect. Pity slid off her like rain off a wing. This was not pity. This was a man looking across at her, not down, and she had forgotten. She genuinely had forgotten what it felt like to be seen at eye level by someone who understood the exact shape of the thing that had been done to her. It went into her like cold water. She looked at the sleeping airplanes so she would not have to look at him, and she told him the part she had never told anyone on that ramp. And as she told it, the whole architecture of 2 years came up out of her in order, the way a checklist comes up out of the body. The medical lapsing on a Tuesday she barely remembered, and the first job she applied for and didn't get, and the second, and the 10th, and the slow, terrible arithmetic of a woman watching every door in her profession close with the same soft click while she stood there with 4,000 hours in her hands, and no way to prove to anyone that the hands still worked. Until the closing had happened so many times that she had begun, against everything her grandmother ever taught her, to suspect the doors were right, and the fault was hers, and the pilot she used to be had simply been a thing she made up. She told him she'd been a first officer. She told him about the 4,200 hours, and the right seat of the G550, and the 18 months and the money it took to build the rating into her hands. She told him about the medical lapsing, and the arithmetic, and the $3,410, and how the whole thing had come apart so fast and so quietly that she still, 2 years later, could not point to the exact place where it broke. She said she'd applied to fly again. Everywhere. For 2 years. And every door had closed the same soft way, without a reason, until she'd started to wonder if the reason was just her. "Something's wrong with my name," she said. One direct line into the dark. "I've felt it for 2 years. I just can't see it." Everett Grange, who had read the flag on Whitmer's terminal the night before, went very still. He did not tell her. Not yet. He was a man who had spent 40 years learning when a thing on a page was wrong, and he knew that if he handed her the lie now, half confirmed, he would be handing her a wound without the stitches, and she deserved the whole truth or none of it. So he did the thing he had done at 19 in a crew lounge with borrowed manuals. He went looking. Quietly. On his own. Here is what Everett Grange did over the next 4 days, and he did it himself, because some things you do not delegate. He pulled her original training records. Not the crew records flag, the actual file, the sim reports and check ride forms from the training center that had issued her G550 type rating. He had the standing to request them and the patience to read them, and he read every page, the way Ruth Colson had once read a tray table for crumbs nobody else would check. There was no check ride failure. There had never been a check ride failure. Renata Colson had passed her type ride on the first attempt with the examiner's note that used the word exemplary, a word check pilots do not spend. Her sim records were clean. Her line checks were clean. Every document generated by every person who had ever actually watched her fly said the same thing in the flat language of aviation, which does not flatter and does not lie. This pilot is good. This pilot is better than good. He read the sim reports one at a time, in the quiet of an office at an hour when no one else was in the building. Emergency descent satisfactory. Engine failure at V1 satisfactory. Single engine approach to minimums, 20-knot crosswind. The examiner had written the word smooth and underlined it. Rejected takeoff. Rapid depressurization. Wind shear escape. Page after page of a pilot doing, correctly and under pressure, every terrible thing an airplane can do to you, and handling each one with the same unhurried competence that had made her correct a fuel limit reflexively at 5 in the morning, 2 years after anyone last let her near a cockpit. Everett Grange did the walk-around on her whole record. He checked every seam, and every seam held. The only crack in the entire structure was a single line in one database, and that line had not come from an airplane or an examiner or a fact. It had come from a man. The check ride failure do not hire flag existed in exactly one place. The crew records database. Entered once. 26 months ago. By a login belonging to the Grange Flight Department. Everett sat with that for a while. He had built a $2 billion company by understanding that a number in the wrong column is never an accident. Someone puts it there, and someone benefits. He did not yet know the whole shape of it. But he knew the flag was a lie, and he knew it had been typed by someone inside his own house, and he knew that the woman drinking homemade coffee on an overturned bucket had been walled out of her own life by a single false line she had never been allowed to see. The paper said she failed. The paper was the only thing in the entire record that said so. The scheduler's name was Sylvia Reyes. She was 41, and she had worked the Grange Flight Department for 9 years, and when Everett's assistant sent down a routine request to confirm the provenance of a crew records entry from 26 months back, entry timestamp, originating login, authorizing signature, Sylvia Reyes opened the ticket, read the name attached to the record, and felt the floor tilt. Renata Colson. She knew that name. She had typed it late on an evening 26 months ago, with Dale Whitmer standing behind her chair, telling her which words to put in the box. Check ride failure, do not rehire. For a pilot Sylvia had never met, whose file she had never had any honest reason to touch. She had known it was wrong. She had known it the way you know the thing you are doing is wrong while your hands keep doing it. And she had done it anyway, because the flight department was the only job that had ever paid her enough to keep her own kids housed, and Whitmer had made it very clear, without ever saying it outright, that the box got filled or the scheduler got replaced. Sylvia Reyes was not cruel. She was not vindictive. She did not enjoy what she had done, and she had not enjoyed it once in 26 months. She was a single mother of 2, who had been handed a choice between her conscience and her children's roof by a man who would never in his life have to make that choice himself. The economics were exact, the way they always are. Sylvia made $58,000 a year, and her rent was $1,900 a month, and she had a daughter with a seizure disorder, whose medication ran $400, even with the plan the flight department provided, and that plan came with the job, and the job came with Dale Whitmer. She had run the numbers the same way Renata ran hers on a napkin in a break room. If she refused, she lost the job, the plan, the medication, and the apartment, in roughly that order, in roughly 90 days. If she typed 6 words into a box for a stranger she would never meet, she kept all of it. 6 words. That was the price. She had told herself the stranger would land somewhere else, would be fine, would never know. The lies you tell yourself are always the cheap ones. And she had typed the 6 words and gone home and checked her own daughter's forehead in the dark and not slept well since. That was the math she did. Whether it was the right math is a question only she could answer, and she had not answered it yet, though it had been sitting on her chest every night for 2 years. And now, with the name Renata Colson glowing on her screen and an official request for the record's provenance in her queue, the question was finally, unavoidably, being asked out loud. She did not close the ticket. She sat and looked at it for a long time. Somewhere on the far side of the country, a woman she had helped bury was drinking coffee from a thermos on a bucket, and Sylvia Reyes was the only living person besides Dale Whitmer who knew exactly where the body was. She did the walk-around on herself then. Everyone in this story does it eventually. She checked the seam she had spent 2 years refusing to look at, and she did not like what she found, and for the first time she let herself keep looking anyway. Renata knew none of this. She only knew that a man who understood had sat on a bucket beside her in the dark, and that for 4 days something had felt different, the way weather feels different before it turns. She went home to Delary Street. She checked Malik's forehead with 2 fingers. She looked at Deja's newest drawing, The airplane, the single line, the climb, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself think a dangerous thought, the kind of thought she had trained herself not to have because hope, unpaid, is just another bill. Deja had been drawing that same picture for as long as she could hold a pencil. An airplane nose up off a single straight line. Renata had never asked her why because she was afraid of the answer, but that night she sat on the edge of the mattress and asked. Deja said the plane was always leaving. Renata asked where it was going. And her 11-year-old looked at her like the answer was obvious, and said it was going wherever her mama used to go, back when she came home happy instead of tired, and Renata had to go stand in the kitchen in the dark for a minute, by the burned-out bulb, until her face was hers again. Her daughter had been drawing her mother's grief for 2 years and calling it an airplane. A license is a piece of paper the government can let expire. A rating is something you build into your hands, and nobody, not a director, not a rumor, not 26 months, not a single false line in a database she was never allowed to see, can unbuild it. She had spent 2 years believing the problem might be her. She was about to find out it never was. Everett Grange did not fire Dale Whitmer. That is the first thing to understand about what happened, because it is the thing that separates justice from revenge, and Everett had spent 4 days making very sure he was building the first one. Firing Whitmer would have felt good for an afternoon and fixed nothing. The lie would still sit in the database. The record would still say Renata Colson failed. And a man who fires people in anger is a man who does not want the whole story to come out. He wants it to go away. Everett did not want this to go away. He wanted it in the light, every inch of it, where it could not be unseen. So he called a meeting instead. A records review. Routine on the calendar, nothing to alarm anyone. He asked the director of flight operations to bring the crew records file on a former applicant named Colson, and he asked Sylvia Reyes to be present as the department's records custodian, and he did not say why. Dale Whitmer walked into that conference room the way he walked everywhere, like the floor should be grateful, carrying a tablet and the unshakable confidence of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything beneath his notice. Everett let him talk first. He asked Whitmer to summarize the Colson file, and Whitmer, not yet smelling the thing in the room, pulled it up and read the flag aloud in the bored voice of a man reciting a parking ticket. Check ride failure, do not rehire, 26 months back, standard washout, nothing to see. Then Everett Grange set a second folder on the table. He did it without drama. He just set it down, squared it to the edge, and slit it 2 inches toward the center. A plain manila folder, thicker than the first. He said it was the original training file, the one from the certification center, the sim reports, the check ride forms. He said he'd read every page. He asked Whitmer, in a voice that had closed billion-dollar deals and did not need to rise, to find him the check ride failure, to point to it on any page in the actual record, because he, Everett, had looked for 4 days and could not locate a failure that 100 pages of documentation insisted had never occurred. The room got very quiet. Whitmer opened the folder. He had to. Everyone was watching, and not opening it was its own confession. He turned pages. He turned them the way you pat your pockets for keys you already know are not there. Faster, then slower, than not really reading at all, just moving paper to buy a face that would not cooperate. Exemplary. Smooth underlined. Satisfactory, satisfactory, satisfactory. Page after page of a pilot he had erased, testifying in the flat voice of the record that she had been, all along, exactly what he had told the world she was not. Whitmer's confidence did what confidence does when the floor is finally gone from under it. It kept talking for a few seconds after it should have stopped. He said there must have been a verbal report, an informal note, something that hadn't made the formal file. Some conversation, he said, with someone at the training center, he couldn't recall who. He said these things fast and then slower, and each sentence was smaller than the one before it, the way a man sounds walking backward toward a wall he has forgotten is there. Everett did not help him. That was its own kind of mercy withheld on purpose. He let the sentences get small. He let the room hear them get small. Then he said the record was entered from a Grange Flight Department login. He said he could pull the timestamp and the authorizing credential in about 4 minutes. Then he turned, not to Whitmer, but to the woman who had been sitting silent at the end of the table for the entire meeting. He asked Sylvia Reyes whose login it was. Here is the wider truth: the room was standing inside, whether they knew it or not. Renata Colson was not a freak accident. She was a data point. The Refuel Whitmer could erase a black woman pilot with 6 words and assume no one would ever check is that the sky already looked the way he needed it to look, and one more empty seat did not stand out. More than 90% of the time, when you hear "this is your captain speaking" on a U.S. airline, the speaker is a white man. The profession is currently estimated at about 92% white and 95% male. Just 3.4% of U.S. airline pilots are black. Women 4.6. And at the intersection where Renata Colson stood, a black woman holding a type rating, the number stops being a percentage. It becomes a head count. A small one. Roughly 150 black women in the entire United States hold the professional pilot certificates she holds. 150. About 0.1% of all professional pilots. A rounding error. A number so small that when one of them is pushed out of the sky does not appear to change at all. That is what made the lie so cheap to tell. Not because Renata was replaceable, she was, by the flat testimony of her own records, exceptional, but because the system was already shaped to expect her absence. The doors were already closed. Whitmer only had to make sure one stayed closed, and the profession's own demographics would swallow the sound. The barriers are not a mystery. The people who study this name the same 3 every time: the wall of cost, the opacity of the hiring pipeline, and the plain historical fact that most would-be pilots who are not white men do not know a single person on the inside to guide them through it. Renata had beaten all 3 once. She had built the rating, found the pipeline, done the impossible arithmetic. And a man had undone it with a keystroke because he was betting the sky would never miss her. He was about to lose that bet in a conference room, in front of the one person who could prove it. Sylvia Reyes had rehearsed 100 ways to keep her mouth shut, and in the end she used none of them. She had brought something to the meeting she was not asked to bring. A printout, folded once, that she had pulled from her own sent items archive, the night the provenance request came through. A message, 26 months old, that she had saved the way you save the thing you already know. You will someday need to prove you were not the only one in the room. She set it on the table next to the 2 folders. She said the login was hers. She did not hide behind the passive voice, and later she would be proud of that when the moment came she had said the login was hers and not an entry was made. Then she said the rest of it in a voice that shook and did not stop. She said she had typed the words "check ride failure, do not rehire" on an evening 26 months ago, and that she had typed them because Dale Whitmer stood behind her chair and told her to, and that the printout on the table was his instruction, in writing, with his name on it, telling her to flag a pilot he wanted, kept out to protect a hire he wanted kept in. She said she had known it was a lie when she typed it. She wanted that on the record too. She was not going to launder her own part in it. Then Sylvia Reyes, 41, single mother of 2, looked across the table at the man who had made her choose between her conscience and her daughter's medication, and she did the walk-around out loud, on herself, in front of everyone. She said she had told herself for 2 years that the woman would land somewhere else and be fine. She said she had checked the news once, a year in, and found a LinkedIn that said contract line service at an FBO in New Orleans, and had closed the laptop and not looked again, because looking meant knowing, and knowing meant this. She said she was sorry. She said it to a woman who was not in the room, which is the only kind of sorry that costs anything, because it buys you nothing. Dale Whitmer said her name once, a warning, the old muscle memory of a man who had controlled this woman for 9 years. It did not work anymore. The thing he had used to control her, the job, the plan, the medication, the roof, was the same thing Everett Grange had just watched him weaponize, and it would not be his to hold much longer. And here is the part the room did not expect. When it was over, Everett did not fire Sylvia Reyes either. He could have. She had typed the lie with her own hands, and she had said so out loud on the record, which is exactly why he didn't. A person who walks toward the truth carrying the receipt for her own guilt is not the danger in the room. The danger was the man who had never carried anything. Sylvia kept her job. She kept the plan. Her daughter kept the medication. And Everett made one quiet arrangement he told almost no one about, that the department's records custodian would, going forward, report outside the chain of the director, so that no one behind a chair could ever again tell her which 6 words to type. He did not do it to reward her. He did it because a system that had let one Whitmer stand behind one Sylvia would let it happen again, and he was done, at 58, letting it happen again. What followed was not an explosion. It was a cascade, and a cascade moves one link at a time. An internal audit opened before the end of the week. Not just of the Colson record, but of every crew record's flag entered under Whitmer's tenure, because a man who will falsify one has to be assumed to have falsified others, and Everett Grange did not build $2 billion by assuming the first roach he found was the only one. Dale Whitmer was suspended, pending the audit, and walked out of the building he had run like he owned the people in it, carrying a box, not looking at the line crew, who, for once, were all looking at him. Marcus Toll was on the ramp when the crew van took Whitmer away. He did not gloat. Gloating was not the thing in his chest. What was in his chest was the memory of a good mechanic on a carrier going still under a dressing down from a man who didn't know a torque wrench from a tire iron, and the 2 years he had spent since watching a rated pilot drag his fuel hoses in silence, and the single question he had finally asked her by the wing, "What did you use to fly?" that had, it turned out, not been too late after all. He found out later that his one question, and the near answer it earned, was part of what had told Everett the door could still be opened. He never told Renata that. He just started calling her Captain, quietly, on the ramp, months before she had any legal right to the word, and the first time he did it she had to turn and check a fuel cap that did not need checking. The false flag on Renata Colson's record was formally expunged, not softened, not annotated, but pulled out by the root, and the original training file, the one that said exemplary and smooth and satisfactory, restored as the only record of who she was. And because a falsified airman record is not merely an HR matter but a question of certification integrity, the whole department's records were referred for outside review, which meant the flight operation Dale Whitmer had run on whispers and buried keystrokes was, effectively, grounded until every seam he had ever refused to check was checked by someone else. Through all of it, Everett Grange did not write Renata a single check. He wanted to. It would have been easy, and easy was the temptation he had learned to distrust. But he understood now what she had told him by the fuel truck, understood it all the way down. A check would have made her his good deed, and she did not need a good deed. She needed the lie killed and the truth reinstated and her name returned to her clean, so that whatever she did next, she did as a pilot whose record was finally, only, the truth, and not as a woman a billionaire felt sorry for. Justice first. The record first. The money, if it came at all, would come last, and it would come as what she had earned, not as what she'd been given. He had checked what nobody sees. And underneath 26 months of somebody else's lie, exactly where the paperwork swore she wasn't, he had found the pilot. Still there. Still current in every way that a database cannot certify and cannot erase. Now she just had to be told. He didn't tell her in an office. He told her in the hangar at the end of a shift, standing under the wing of N550EG, because he understood by then that where a thing is said is part of what is said. He had a folder with him. He did not open with it. He opened with the truth, spoken plainly, the way she had asked for it by the fuel truck, that there had never been a check ride failure. That she had passed on the first attempt, exemplary, and that a man named Dale Whitmer had typed a lie into a database 26 months ago to protect a favor, and that a woman named Sylvia Reyes had typed it for him with a gun made of her daughter's medication held to her head, and that both of those things were now true out loud on the record, where they could not be unsaid. Renata Colson stood very still and listened to 2 years rearrange themselves. She did not cry. Not yet. She did the thing she always did. She ran the walk-around, checked the story for the seam where it would fail, because hope had failed her so many times that she had learned to pre-flight it. And the story held. Every panel of it held. The doors had not closed because of her. The doors had been closed by a hand, a specific hand with a name, and the hand had been caught, and the record was clean, and the pilot the world had spent 2 years telling her she'd only imagined had been real the entire time. That was when Everett Grange said the thing she would carry the rest of her life. He did not say she was hired. He did not say he'd pay for anything. He looked at a woman who had dragged his fuel hoses for $16 an hour with 4,000 hours in her hands, and he said, "You never stopped being a pilot. The airplane knew it every time you touched it. I'm just the first one in 26 months to say it out loud." He stopped. His voice did not rise. "I see you. And you were never grounded. You were buried. That's different, and it ends today." And this was the whole point. Not the folder. Not the cleared record. Not the airplane behind them, or the $2 billion, or the justice grinding through an audit somewhere across the country. It was one man who had been buried himself at 19 and had spent 40 years mistaking the buying of airplanes for the digging out, standing in a hangar, telling a woman he barely knew that he had seen what nobody had bothered to see, and that it mattered, and that she mattered, and that she was not, and had never been, alone in it. For 26 months, nobody had checked what nobody sees. Then a man who fueled his own memories did the walk-around on her, and found the pilot still there, exactly where the paperwork swore she wasn't. Renata Colson cried then, not for the reason people cry in stories. She cried the way you cry when you have been carrying something so long you forgot it had weight, and someone finally takes one end. Everything after that was the downslope. It mattered, it changed her life, but it was the epilogue to the real thing, and Everett made sure it stayed that way. He did not write her a check. He had learned that lesson at a fuel truck. Instead, he did something a proud woman could accept. He built it as a program, and he made her the first name in it, not the charity case at the bottom of it. Grange Logistics would sponsor the reinstatement of qualified, records-cleared aviators who had been pushed out of currency by cost, the medical, the recurrent sim, the recency training, as a documented professional pathway, with an application and a standard and a name that was not Renata's. She was not a handout. She was the pilot the program was designed around, which is a different thing, and the difference was the only part she cared about. So she went back to the sim. She sat in the box for the first time in 26 months, and her hands did not fumble, because hands that built a rating do not forget it. Emergency descent. Engine failure at V1. Single engine approach to minimums, 20-knot crosswind. Smooth, the instructor wrote and underlined it, and did not know he was the second person to underline that word about her, and would not have understood why she had to sit for a moment when he did. Her medical was reinstated. Her currency restored. $3,410, the wall that had held for 2 years, turned out in the end to be a wall someone had built on purpose, and a wall that came down the moment the truth did. And then, on a gray morning over Lake Pontchartrain on a repositioning leg with an empty cabin, Renata Colson sat in the right seat of N55EG, the exact airplane she had fueled in the dark, the exact model her grandmother had once wiped down for other people's comfort, and put her hands on the yoke that was, this time, hers to use. She ran the walk around herself, out on the ramp in the cold, the way she always had, the way Ruth taught her. She checked the fuel caps flush. She ran her palm down the leading edge, the seam nobody checks, and this time she was not checking someone else's airplane before someone else flew it. She was checking hers. Every seam held. Everyone. Then she climbed the air stair, the same air stair Everett Grange had come down 8 weeks earlier to ask her a question, and she sat down in the seat, and she ran the flow, out loud this time, because there was finally someone in the other seat who was supposed to hear it. The APU came up rough on start exactly the way she'd told Marcus it would. She smiled at that. And when they released brakes and the airplane began to roll, it wandered a little left on the taxi, the way this model always did, the way she had known it would every single morning she walked past it with a fuel hose, and she corrected it with a pressure of her foot so small it was almost a memory. And the airplane did what she told it, because the airplane had always known who she was. Then she flew. A man worth $2.1 billion owned that airplane, and the fleet around it, and the hangar with his name on the side. But the most valuable thing Everett Grange ever did with any of it was stand in a hangar for 4 minutes and tell one buried pilot that he saw her, and then get out of the way and let her fly it herself. Dale Whitmer did not fly anything for a long time after that. The audit found what audits find once someone finally looks. He had done it before. Not often, he was careful, but more than once a name flagged, a rival buried, a favor protected, always the same 6-word weight dropped on someone who couldn't push back. He had taken people's records. And now a record, the true one, the audit, his own name entered in a database he could not reach behind a chair to alter, took his. His certifications went under review. The department he had run on whispers was grounded pending the integrity audit. Every seam he'd refused to check now checked by strangers who owed him nothing. He had unmade a pilot with a false record. A true record unmade him. That is not irony. That is just what happens when a man who never does the walk-around finally becomes the thing being inspected. There is a drawing on the refrigerator on Delary Street now, held up by a magnet shaped like a tiny plane. It is an airplane nose angled up off a single straight line climbing. Deja has been drawing that same picture since before she could spell. But this one is different, and the difference is the whole story. In this one, there is a small figure in the front window of the airplane, in the left-hand seat, drawn in the careful way an 11-year-old draws the thing that matters most. And under the wing, in block letters a child copied off the side of a jet her mother pointed to once, is a tail number, N550EG. For 2 years Deja had drawn airplanes leaving, going wherever her mother used to go, back when she came home happy instead of tired. She doesn't draw them leaving anymore. She draws them with her mother inside going up. Same airplane. Same single line. Same climb. The person had changed. This story is fictional. Renata Colson is not a real person. But the systems it describes are real, and they are grounding real pilots right now. The cost wall is real. A first-class medical certificate must be renewed every 6 to 12 months, out of pocket, because insurance treats it as an occupational cost, not care. A type rating on the open market runs $25,000 to $40,000. Recurrent training to stay current stacks up year after year. For a pilot with money, it is a line item. For a pilot holding on with both hands, it is a wall, and the people who fall off that wall are, overwhelmingly, the ones who were already climbing it alone. And the sky shows it. More than 90% of U.S. airline captains are white men. The profession is estimated at about 92% white and 95% male. Only about 3.5% of airline pilots are black. Fewer than 5% are women. And black women, pilots exactly like the one in this story, number by the best available count, around 150 in the entire country. About 0.1%. A number so small the sky doesn't seem to change when one of them is pushed out of it. That is what makes a lie like the one in this story cheap to tell. Not because these pilots are replaceable, they are extraordinary, but because a system already shaped to expect their absence will swallow the sound. If you are one of those pilots, or you love one, or you just don't want the sky to keep looking like this, the ladders are real too. The FAA has a defined pathway to reinstate a lapsed medical and restore currency. It is a process, not a locked door. The Organization of Black Aerospace Professionals, OBAP, runs scholarships and its ACE academies for young aviators. Sisters of the Skies exist specifically to put more black women in the flight deck, with scholarships and mentorship. And for anyone in the kind of hardship Renata was in, one light bill from the dark, dialing 211 connects you to local help with rent, utilities, and food, free in most of the country. Here is the thing the whole story was really about. A license is a piece of paper the government can let expire. A rating is something you build into your hands, and nobody, not a director, not a roomer, not 26 months, not one false line in a database, can unbuild it. The tragedy is never that the skill disappears. It doesn't. The tragedy is that we let a wall, or a lie, or a look that says some people fuel the airplanes and some people fly them, decide who gets to use what they already earned. So do the walk-around. On the people around you. Check the seam nobody checks. The most overqualified person in the room might be the one holding the hose, and all it takes sometimes is one person willing to look across instead of down and say the thing out loud, "I see you." If this one stayed with you, don't share it for the algorithm. Share it for the conversation.